The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the massive fuselage of Qantas Flight 001 as it descended toward Bangkok's Don Mueang Airport. Inside the cockpit, Captain Warren Banks adjusted his grip on the control yoke, his gaze locked on the rain-slicked runway ahead. The Boeing 747-400, a behemoth of engineering, carried over 400 passengers, and every soul on board depended on the decisions made in the next few moments. "Wind shear advisory," First Officer Matthew Carter muttered, scanning the flight instruments. "Severe rainfall, gusts peaking at 35 knots. Banks exhaled, steady but aware of the tension tightening his muscles. "Roger that, stay sharp." The windshield wipers struggled against the torrential downpour, streaking water rather than clearing it. The approach was already fraught with difficulty. Poor visibility, standing water on the runway, and now unpredictable gusts that could throw off their descent at any second. "Flaps full, speed check," Banks called out. "Flaps full," Carter confirmed, flipping the switch. The aircraft trembled slightly as the drag increased. The runway lights blurred through the rain, ghostly and distant. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. "Qantas 001, wind from 090 at 25 knots, heavy rain, cleared to land, runway 21L. Banks acknowledged the clearance, but his focus remained on the approaching tarmac. The Boeing 747 fought against the turbulence as it neared the ground, buffeted by powerful gusts. The descent rate was higher than he liked, but they were committed. Now, no room for a missed approach. 500 feet, Carter announced. "Stable," Banks responded, though his jaw clenched at the sight of pooling water covering the runway. The risk of hydroplaning was real. As the altimeter ticked down, Banks eased back slightly on the controls, guiding the massive jet toward the threshold. The aircraft's wheels kissed the soaked tarmac with a jolt, sending a spray of water exploding outward in a dazzling burst. The roar of the engines reversed as he deployed full-thrust reversers, applying maximum braking force. And then, nothing. The aircraft was still moving. The tires skimmed over the standing water, refusing to grip the slick surface. The Boeing 747, a 400-ton steel colossus, had effectively become a sled, hydroplaning uncontrollably. A battle with physics. Banks' instincts screamed at him, but his training held firm. His hand slammed the throttles fully into reverse while his foot pumped the brakes, feeling no response. "We're not slowing down." Carter's voice cracked with tension, eyes darting between the speed indicators and the rapidly approaching. "End of the runway. Full brake pressure," Banks barked, his voice level but laced with urgency. The aircraft was still hurtling forward at an alarming rate. The ground beneath them was more water than pavement now, and the rubber tires had lost all traction. The anti-skid system was useless. The brakes couldn't grip what they weren't touching. The massive plane continued to glide, defying everything it was built to do. A muffled gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers gripped their armrests, some realizing that something was wrong, others still unaware of the unfolding crisis. Flight attendants, strapped into their jump seats, exchanged wide-eyed glances but remained silent, awaiting orders. The speed bled off agonizingly slowly. The massive aircraft fought against inertia, but the end of the runway loomed closer. Beyond. "Hit the airport perimeter fence. Beyond that, a deep drainage canal. 30 knots and still rolling," Carter called out. "Come on, come on." Banks growled, gripping the control yoke as though sheer willpower could slow the plane. The aircraft skidded past the final taxiway exit. The runway's end lights flashed beneath them, disappearing under the nose wheel. The waterlogged tarmac gave way to sodden grass, then dirt, the Boeing 747's enormous weight causing the ground to sink beneath it. Banks barely had time to register the looming concrete barrier before. Boom! The impact. The jarring crash sent shockwaves through the cabin as the nose wheel slammed into the drainage ditch, snapping upward at a sickening angle. The cockpit lurched violently, and Banks's harness locked, keeping him pinned to his seat. The cabin erupted in a cacophony of screams as overhead compartments burst open, spewing luggage and loose objects into the air. The sheer force of the impact rattled through the fuselage like a seismic shock, shaking everything to its core. The nose dipped further into the ditch, bringing the aircraft to a sudden, violent stop. The tail section, however, remained momentarily. Suspended before gravity won the battle. The full weight of the plane crashed down with an ear-splitting groan of bending metal. Then, silence. For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the rain hammering against the fuselage, as if the storm itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the outcome. Then, from the cockpit speakers, "Evacuate! Evacuate!" A race against time. Banks tore off his headset, his fingers flying over the switches to shut down the engines. "Get everyone out now!" he barked at Carter. Carter was already moving, reaching for the emergency checklist. "Deploying slides," he confirmed. In the cabin, the flight attendants sprang into action, their rigorous training kicking in. The emergency lights bathed the interior in an eerie red glow as passengers fumbled with seatbelts, their panicked breathing filling the space. "Leave your bags, move to the nearest exit." A flight attendant yelled over the chaos. The doors burst open, and the inflatable slides unfurled, their orange chutes illuminated by the flickering runway lights. One by one, passengers hurled themselves down, some landing in heaps, others sprinting, away from the aircraft as fast as their trembling legs could carry them. Banks was the last to leave the cockpit, ensuring every system was shut down before he turned to follow. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled his nostrils as he stepped out, the cold rain instantly soaking his uniform. He barely had time to assess the damage. The 747's nose was buried in the ditch, the forward landing gear completely collapsed. Miraculously, the fuselage remained intact. No fire, no structural breach. As he hit the wet pavement, his boots splashing in the rain, he scanned the huddled mass of passengers and crew. Some sobbed, others clung to one another, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering terror. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone was alive. The aftermath rescue vehicles raced toward the scene, their flashing lights cutting through the rain. Banks exhaled, running a hand over his rain-drenched face. Carter came up beside him, panting. "We should have stopped," he muttered. "That shouldn't have happened." Banks nodded slowly, his mind already dissecting the events. The heavy rain, the hydroplaning, the ineffective braking, it had all conspired against them. But in the end, they had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. As the first responders reached them, Banks looked back at the crippled Boeing 747, its massive frame resting half-submerged in the mud. It was a sight he would never forget, and neither would the world. The sirens of approaching emergency vehicles echoed through the rain-soaked air, flashing red and blue lights cutting through the night like beacons of salvation. The thick smell of burning rubber still clung to the wreckage, mingling with the scent of rain and damp earth. Captain Warren Banks stood near the huddled survivors, his uniform clinging to his skin, drenched from the downpour. He exhaled slowly, watching as the first responders worked their way through the crowd. The Boeing 747-400, his aircraft, his responsibility, lay wounded in the mud, its nose sunken deep into the drainage ditch like a defeated giant. The sight gnawed at him. Planes weren't supposed to end up like this. A voice crackled over a handheld radio near him. "Status on casualties?" A paramedic turned to her colleague, shaking her head. No fatalities, minor injuries, scrapes, bruises, some possible fractures, but nothing life-threatening. Banks let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. No one had died. That was the only victory he had right now. Matthew Carter, his first officer, stepped beside him, arms crossed, staring at the wreckage. "I still can't believe we didn't stop in time," he muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. "We had full reverse thrust, max braking, everything. It should have worked." Banks didn't respond. He was replaying the landing in his mind. The moment they touched down, the realization that they weren't slowing, the helplessness as they skidded past the runway's end. Something had gone terribly wrong. A figure in a dark blue rain slicker strode toward them, clipboard in hand. Banks recognized the man instantly. James Holloway, chief investigator for the Civil Aviation Authority of Thailand, CAAT. He had the look of a man who had seen far too many aircraft incidents. Captain Banks, First Officer Carter. Holloway's voice was even, but there was an undertone of urgency. Glad to see you both in one piece. He glanced toward the crippled jet, shaking his head. We need to start figuring out what went wrong. Can you both walk me through exactly what happened? Piecing together the puzzle, Banks, and Carter recounted the sequence of events. The turbulent approach, the rain, the runway conditions, the moment they realized they weren't slowing down. Holloway scribbled notes, occasionally nodding but saying, "Little, the standing water was worse than expected," Carter added. Hydroplaning started almost immediately. Did you feel any traction at all? Holloway asked. Banks shook his head. Nothing. It felt like we were on ice. The brakes were useless, Holloway frowned. And full reverse thrust? Deployed as soon as we touched down. But even with max reverse and full braking, we just kept going. The investigator pursed his lips, his eyes scanning the wreckage. We'll need to examine the runway surface, but based on what you're telling me, we're looking at a combination of factors. Hydroplaning for sure, but that shouldn't have made braking completely ineffective. He turned to a nearby technician. We need the flight data recorders as soon as possible. Banks exhaled. The black boxes. They would tell the truth in cold, undeniable data, but the answers wouldn't come tonight. The weight of responsibility, as the emergency crews continued their work. Banks walked toward the passengers, many still shivering in blankets provided by airport personnel. Some were crying, some sat in stunned silence, others whispered to each other in quiet disbelief. One man, a middle-aged businessman with a bloodied cut across his forehead, stood up as Banks approached. "Captain," he said, his voice unsteady, "we thought we were going to die." Banks met his gaze. "I know." There was nothing else to say. No apology would feel adequate. No reassurance could erase the sheer terror these passengers had experienced. A woman clutched her child close, her eyes rimmed with tears. "Thank you for getting us down safely," she whispered. Banks swallowed hard. "You're safe now, that's what matters." Corporate pressure. By the time the initial chaos settled, the rain had finally begun to lighten. Banks and Carter were led to an airport briefing room, where airline officials, investigators, and Qantas representatives had already gathered. A large screen displayed a diagram of the runway, with impact points and skid marks highlighted in red. A tall man in a crisp suit stood near the screen, arms crossed. David Langford, Qantas's head of flight operations. His expression was unreadable, but Banks could already sense the pressure radiating from him. "Gentlemen," Langford began, his voice cool and professional, "this incident is going to attract a lot of scrutiny. A Qantas 747 overshooting a runway in Bangkok? It's already making headlines." Banks clenched his jaw. He wasn't surprised. Incidents like this didn't stay quiet for long. Holloway cleared his throat. "We're still gathering data, but initial signs point to severe hydroplaning and potential braking inefficiency. The aircraft should have stopped within the available distance, but it didn't." Langford's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting a mechanical failure?" Holloway hesitated. "It's too early to say. We need to analyze the braking system and runway conditions. But based on the crew's account, it seems like they did everything by the book." Langford exhaled, turning to Banks. "Captain, did you notice anything unusual about the aircraft's handling before landing?" Banks shook his head. "Nothing. The approach was rough, but everything was functioning normally until touchdown." Langford nodded, as if filing the information away. "For now, Qantas will fully cooperate with the investigation. But let me be clear. We need answers. Fast." Banks understood the unspoken message. Incidents like this could shake public confidence. A few bad headlines and Qantas's reputation would take a hit. The airline needed this resolved, preferably without placing blame on them. The truth emerges the next morning. As the investigation intensified, a breakthrough emerged. Engineers inspecting the aircraft's braking system discovered abnormalities in the anti-skid mechanism. The system, designed to prevent wheels from locking under heavy braking, had not functioned properly. Instead of modulating brake pressure, it had left the aircraft in a prolonged hydroplane. unable to regain traction. Banks sat in stunned silence as Holloway relayed the findings. "So, it wasn't just the rain," Carter muttered. Holloway nodded grimly. "The system failure meant that instead of slowing down efficiently, you were essentially skimming over the water like a skipping stone." Langford folded his arms. "Was this a maintenance oversight?" Holloway shook his head. "We'll need more analysis, but preliminary reports suggest it was a rare system malfunction. Nothing the crew could have foreseen or prevented." Banks let out a slow breath, the weight on his shoulders easing slightly. They had done everything right. It hadn't been pilot error, but still, the question lingered. How close had they come to disaster? A reflection on fate later that evening. As the chaos subsided, Banks found himself staring out over the airport tarmac, watching another 747 take off into the night sky. Carter joined him, hands in his pockets. "Hell of a day." Banks exhaled. "Hell of a landing." Silence stretched between them before Carter spoke again. "Do you ever think about what could have happened? If we'd been going just a little faster? If the ditch hadn't stopped us?" Banks didn't answer right away. Instead, he thought about the faces of the passengers, the weight of responsibility, the fine line between survival and catastrophe. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I do." Carter sighed. "Makes you wonder how much of this job is skill, and how much is just fate." Banks looked up at the sky, the storm now just a memory. "Maybe a little of both," he said, and with that, they turned away from the wreckage, stepping forward into whatever came next.